folks. Hello, everyone out there, Facebook, YouTube. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. I'm going to bring in our live participants on Zoom as well. Hey, guys on Zoom, welcome. Great to see you here. Thanks for joining us today for Piano Tech Radio Hour. I'll spotlight myself and our esteemed guests for the day. Yeah, we'll just take a minute, let people get settled, then I'll introduce the program, and we will get rolling. Hope everyone had a happy Halloween. And I went out with my son, who is 7, and I was Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he was Luke Skywalker, and mom was Princess Leia. So that was fun. And he got a ton of candy. I feel like 7 years old is the age where you've basically become uh, a professional trick-or-treater. You know, you have the
Mm.
experience, you have the athletic training, so that you can quickly go from house to house. You've got like candy collection techniques under your belt. So yeah, it was pretty epic. And all right, so this is Piano Tech Radio Hour, everyone. I want to welcome you to the program, which airs every week. We gather here every Saturday to meet with and learn from the most fascinating and knowledgeable folks in the piano world. This includes manufacturers, rebuilders, musicians, makers of other instruments, and of course, piano techs. Our mutual goal is to become better at our crafts and to help each other to create an ever more musical world together. Piano Tech Radio Hour is brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, an online learning resource that brings you cutting edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. You can find out more at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. You can also subscribe to Radio Hour. It's just $16 a month. You get direct access to each week's private Zoom call, as well as all the archival recordings of well over 200 episodes in our member area. Join using the link bit.ly/join PTRH. That's bit.ly/join PTRH. Remember to check out our audio-only versions of the program on the podcast, pianotechradio.com. We've ranked number up in the top 100, top 10, number 1 sometimes in various locales in the performing arts category on iTunes. Got a global reach, and we're growing in popularity day by day. Additionally, you can check out our social medias. We've got LinkedIn, we've got Instagram, we've got Facebook, Twitter. We also have a blog at Substack that you can check out that gives you a sneak peek at the content that is in our member area for Piano Technicians Masterclasses. And you can always sign up for our email list at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. And a quick plug for a new project that's somewhat related, the Future Education Podcast. You can find out more about that at uotu.xyz. All right, let us meet our guest for the day. His name is Ben Kapilow. He is assistant professor and music director for SUNY Cortland's BFA BA programs in music theater. Ben brings together the artistry of performance and the discipline of teaching, shaping the next generation of creative talent. His journey spans conducting for professional productions, composing award-winning choral works, and creating the acclaimed All Keyed Up podcast, which became one of the top piano education podcasts worldwide. Ben, welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And where are you located there, being faculty there at SUNY Cortland?
Yeah, I live in the central New York area, about 30 minutes away from Ithaca and Syracuse, if we know that area, but the town is called Cortland.
Okay, wonderful. Um, I always like to start at the beginning and
Mhm.
find out what your musical foundations were. So, what were your earliest exposures to music, and when did you first see the glimmer of this become a profession?
Mhm. I grew up in a very musical family. My father is a professional musician. My mother is not a professional musician, but is very serious about music. So music came from an early age. And I took piano lessons as a child and music classes in school. But really, for me, what launched off my musical interest, which still shapes me to this day, is a teacher I had in eighth grade. Her name is Chris Davis. I always bring her up whenever I can. I've talked about her on my podcast a lot because unlike the piano teachers that I had before her, she was a lot more creatively focused than my previous teachers. A lot of the other teachers were sort of cookie cutter and going through the method books, going through the scales, and more traditional music instructions. And my teachers in school were like that as well. But what Chris did, and again, this is what shapes a lot of the teaching that I do today is it went so far beyond that. There was a lot of composing, songwriting. We would play pieces in all sorts of styles. She would have me write essays. It was a lot more creative than the traditional musical training that most people receive. And from there, that's when I really got interested in music in general, where I got interested in composing, what got me interested in teaching. So the earliest foundations is growing up in a musical family, but what really sealed the deal professionally, I think for me was that teacher in eighth grade.
Wonderful. Um, and as you've proceeded here, and developed a focus on education yourself,
Mhm,
it sounds to me, although, you can clarify, it sounds to me like that one teacher inspired you
mhm,
to make education enriching, right?
mhm.
Maybe a little bit more creative and unique and things like that. Is that also kind of why you like teaching? Is because you like kind of bringing something fresh to the domain?
Absolutely. I'm very passionate in all the things I do, whether it's teaching at a college, whether it's the podcast that I used to do, whether I speak at conferences. The focus is always trying to move music pedagogy into the 21st century and talking about all the resources out there to try to make music instruction more creatively focused and multidisciplinary and contrast it from the types of teachers I had before Chris and the more cookie cutter approach. I would say that's the through line in everything I've done, and it all started with her.
Okay, wonderful. Well, you've shared with us some musical examples,
Mhm,
some compositional works of
mhm.
yours,
Yeah,
and I think it might be fun to just listen to a minute or so of one or
yeah.
two of those during the
Mhm,
program. So I have the bells and tumbling here.
mhm.
Which one do you think might be better to start with? And then once you choose, maybe give a little bit of background on the
Sure.
composition.
Yeah, we can start with the bells. That's the one that's done the most. This is a choral piece. It's a two-part choral piece. It's really intended for educational purposes. Again, basically everything I do, the through line is education. And so composition is no different. And most of what I've composed is for educational purposes. So this is intended for advanced middle school, maybe early high school. And it's a setting of Edgar Allan Poe's work, The Bells. It's not the entire thing. If you read the entire poem, it gets pretty grim by the end, but it's about wedding bells. And so I was really interested in that sound of wedding bells. And so you'll see through the work, there's a lot of imitation of the sound of bells and repeating the phrase bells, bells, bells a lot throughout the piece. This is published by Alfred Publishing. I was really excited because this was chosen by J.W. Pepper for Editor's Choice, and it's for piano and two-part chorus.
And before we listen to it, and you mentioned you make these works for teaching purposes,
Mhm.
is there external resources that you create beyond the composition itself, or is that kind of left to whoever's doing the teaching?
Oh, um, there is a video I have somewhere out with Alfred. I'm not sure if it's still out there that
Mhm.
goes through the piece and talks about what some of the pedagogical intents are with the piece and what to encourage in the performance practice. So I think that video is still out there somewhere. I'd have to check. But
Okay,
if anyone
okay.
is listening and has a chorus and wants to do this piece, I'm happy to send the video to you directly.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's take a listen on
Mhm.
this. All right, gonna go full screen. This window, let's get rid of it. Okay, and let's hit play.
wedding bells, hear the gold and silver bells. What a world of happiness their harmony foretells. Through the balmy air, till the ring of day, till the ring of day, till the golden gods rose in tune. What a liquidity flows through the turtle dove that listens, to the turtle dove that listens. While she gloats on the moon, on the moon, on the moon. Oh, from out the sounding cells, what a gush of euphony, what a gush of euphony, swells. How it dwells. Of the future, how it tells, of the rapture that impels to the swinging and the ringing of the bells, 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 rhyming and the chiming of bells, of the 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 bells, rhyming and the chiming of, rhyming and the chiming of bells, of the 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 bells, bells, of the 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 bells, rhyming and the chiming of, rhyming and the chiming of, rhyming and the chiming of bells.
All right. I like that.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, lots of cool ingredients in that, and
Mhm.
rhythms and harmonies, and
Mhm.
what I like about it too is all the different places it goes, but
Mhm.
you still have continuity.
Oh,
It doesn't feel
thank you.
like you're just like, throwing in something
Meandering,
that,
yes. When I first started
yeah.
composition, that was an issue with a lot of my earlier pieces, is too many ideas, and I had a lot of composition teachers drill that out of me. Another thing I would say about these compositions is I think my approach to composition is similar in my approach to education, and that, at least what I'm trying to do, the listeners can decide if it was successful, is balance sort of rigor and really knowing the craft of what I'm doing, but then also trying to take it in creative direction. So what that means for music education is I try to stay educated on who the different thinkers are and music pedagogues out there and read the standard music pedagogy textbooks, but then also to stay educated on the more contemporary resources and the more creative approach. So it's truly both. And I try to do the same thing with composition. So when I first started, I was more into rigorous classical composition. I went to Peabody Conservatory for a master's in music. And so I'm very interested in the rigorous aspect of composition and knowing as much as I can about music theory. But then unlike in grad school when I was writing these abstract concert pieces that were not especially useful to the world. I like the idea now of writing things that are more pedagogically focused and for children, in some cases writing musicals. And so taking some of the rigor from that background of a master's in composition from a classical music conservatory and applying it to a different format than where someone from that institution would normally target their compositional efforts. So in both cases, whether it's composition or whether it's education, I try to balance rigor with creativity.
Do want to. I kind of am intrigued to hear some of the ones that you actually said aren't as useful to the world, but I think I'll probably enjoy them.
Okay, they're somewhere in the trenches
They
of my
go out
computer,
there.
but
I'm
it
sure they
was
go
pretty
out
out
there a little
there.
bit.
It was very complicated. It was very
These little ones
atonal.
there.
But
All right. Well, yeah, that's wonderful.
mhm.
Yeah, I heard for this particular one, I heard flavors of Bohemian Rhapsody actually.
Oh,
I don't know if that was
what? I've
intentional.
never heard that feedback.
There
That's
was
exciting.
something, yeah, there was something about the
Maybe
harmonies.
the
I was like,
mixed
that's
meter. Sorry, what?
I think it was some of the harmonies. I think some of the harmonies
Hmm.
were similar to
Yeah,
those
maybe the
two.
harmony of easy come, easy go, that sort of
Yeah,
sliding around half steps. I could see
yeah,
some imitation,
exactly.
but there's also some meter changes in that piece. So
Yes.
maybe.
Yeah. But it wasn't the only thing. That was part of it in the beginning. And
Mhm.
then the rhythms, I really like the rhythms of the piano
Yeah.
and things at the end in the middle.
Yeah, a lot of that comes from Bartok is one who I really liked growing up. I played a lot of his pieces and Prokofiev. It doesn't sound like them, but I like that very rhythmically oriented driving approach to piano writing.
Yeah. So tell me what's the process here of the composition, and what I'm asking specifically is Is this one of those things where you're already working with a publisher and they say, hey, we need some pedagogical pieces, you go? Or is it like you're kind of just sitting around and trying to get something together, or maybe you're doing it for a class that you're teaching or a choir you're working with? What's the sort of impetus that begins the process, I guess specifically with this composition, the bells?
This is an earlier composition. So for many years before I had a publisher, I was writing for myself and I was very much self-published. And so I would write a piece and then I would market it to as many children's choruses as I could find. I have some big spreadsheet at one point where I spent a whole day just on Google going county by county, trying to find as many children's choruses as I could, and then a big collection of emails and sending it out everywhere I could find. And so that was very long-winded. And after that got to be too time consuming, I decided to try to find a publisher instead. And so there's a few main publishers out there. There's Alfred is the one that publishes this piece. Some other publishers I have are Choristers Guild, Heritage Press, and then there's some others that I haven't worked with, and most of them accept unsolicited work. So I sent them works. In the case of Alfred, I think I had to send 3 or 4 pieces before they accepted one. And then this is the one that they chose. And then when they accept it, they have an editing team that works with you. So I went back and forth with them, and they gave fantastic feedback. I know stereotypically some other composers and authors as well, it can get very heated with editors, and you feel like they're rewriting your work and it can be a contentious process, but all of the feedback that I got from the editors was really helpful. And that's been true of all the publishers that I've had. It's been really fun to work with the editors and have them give their feedback on what would musically make the most sense, what's pedagogically better, what's most idiomatic for the voices. But fundamentally, the process was creating it myself, pitching it around for a little bit, and then at the same time, pitching it to publishers to see what lands. So far I have 3 pieces published with different publishers.
Great. Let's check out the other one that you shared,
Sure.
tumbling. Any background you want to provide before we get into that one?
This is a very different type of text. This is an anonymous text, so we don't know who said it in the first place, but it's very, very small. It's just in jumping and tumbling. We spend the whole day. Uh, there's only a few more lines. I guess I don't remember all of it off the top of my head, but it's very, very short. So there's a lot of repetition. And so what was fun about this piece is taking a very short bit of text and seeing what I could build out of it. And so there is quite a bit of repetition, not literal music repetition, but text repetition. And it's very playful. Again, it goes back to this idea that I think informs a lot of what I do is balancing rigor with creativity and with fun in the same way that I try to make my teaching fun. That's definitely what I was trying to go for with this piece, Tumbling, because the words are very playful. And so I tried to make the music as playful as I could. And so this is, I would say, a little more lightweight than The Bells. The Bells is, although it's still an energetic piece, it's not quite as playful as I think what I was going for with this one. So I had a lot of fun with rhythms. It's a very short piece, just like the text is very short. This is published by Lorenz Corporation, and this is also for a 2-part choir, just like The Bells.
Okay. All right, let's check it out.
In jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. Jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. Jumping, 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 tumbling, 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 jumping, jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. Jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. Jumping, 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 tumbling, 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 jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. Jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. Till night by arriving, is finish our play. Finish our play. What's then one and all? There's no more to be said. As we tumbled all day, so we tumble to bed. As we tumble to bed. In jumping and tumbling, we spend the whole day. We spend the whole day. We spend the whole day. Jumping, 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 tumbling, 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 tumble, 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 tumble,
Very cool. Sounds like a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And how do these get recorded? Is this you recording it
No,
or?
that's a good part about working with a publisher. Back in the day, before I had a publisher, I would have to record them myself. And so that meant either singing it myself, which is not a good experience for anyone. I'm not much of a singer, or I would do the MIDI recording, which is just Sibelius, which is the music notation program that I use, has a synthesized sort of robot voice that does it. And you can't get the words in the recording, so you have to follow along with the sheet music and listen to this MIDI recording. So one advantage of working with publishers is they record it for you. So they have studios and they make the recording. So that was a very exciting process of working with publishers, is to hear the pieces professionally recorded.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, they've done a good job with those.
Mhm.
Um, Tell me a little bit about your day-to-day
Mhm.
working at SUNY.
Yeah.
Is it classes every day? Is it, are you kind of just attending here and there? What's your schedule
No,
like?
it's a full-time
Full
professor
time.
tenure track position. So we haven't talked about this yet, but my big professional focus outside of composing and teaching has been musical theater. So before I moved to Central New York, I was the resident music director for a theater in the Philadelphia area called the Media Theater. And that was about 7 years there, music directing shows for them throughout the year. And then I switched to this position that I'm in now. And so it's for a BFA musical theater program. So all my students are musical theater performers, want to be on Broadway, that type of person. And so I teach classes in music theory, again, but geared towards musical theater. I teach classes in music history. Again, it's musical theater. So it's the history of musical theater. It's a 2 semester sequence. And then I also music direct all of their shows. So it's music history, music theory, and music directing. And that's
Okay.
the new position. I just started last year. So this is my second year.
Second year. Well,
Mhm.
congratulations. It
Thank
sounds
you.
like quite a journey.
Yes,
Um,
both
and
geographically and
is
metaphorically.
um yeah, I mean, I've been in academia in different places. Of course, I went to
Oh,
music school as well. Um, so yeah, it's
oh,
it's
you've been
uh
in academia as well?
as a PhD student,
Oh,
not
okay.
as a professor or anything like
Sure.
that.
Okay.
And yeah, it's an interesting. It's like an interesting time in history to be,
Oh, well, of course.
working on, tenured professorship,
Yes,
and
it is.
it's great that you have a
Yeah.
place because that's hard to get in the first place.
Yeah. And it's
Um,
interesting to compare going to a school like Peabody, which is a very traditional classical music type school, versus a musical theater program, which is not like that. And then for college, I went to Swarthmore College, which is a liberal arts school and has a music program, but is not focused on music in any way. So I feel like I've seen quite a range of institutions.
I'd love to dive into kind of some of the topics that
Hmm.
you tend to share about
Yeah.
when you're doing your teaching.
Hmm.
I think specifically you sometimes talk about out of the box approaches
Yeah.
to piano lessons or other
Hmm.
types of teaching. What have you found that's kind of out of the box that's resonates?
Sure. So there's a lot to say on this topic. I'll give a brief
Yeah.
overview, and then if there's anything that interests you more, then I'm happy to go into it further. Just out of curiosity, before I answer this, do you think a lot of the listeners are themselves piano teachers?
I
Or-
wouldn't say that the listeners are going to be piano teachers, although probably at least 25%, I would say, of piano technicians have at least taught one piano lesson at some point or
Okay.
another.
So,
It just sort of happens to be another skill that you can do, that
yeah,
overlaps.
maybe there are some
Um,
listeners who might want to get started and it could be in their future,
Yes,
but
the other part of it is too is that as piano technicians, we work with piano teachers
right,
all over the place. Like
right.
that's like bread and butter, connect with all the piano
Mm,
teachers, and then they connect you with their students and things like this.
yes.
Um, but yeah, feel free to go as deep as you want. Don't assume, novice level. Go
Okay,
advanced. I
fair
want to
enough.
I want to go as deep as you can.
Okay, fair enough. Yes. So the big focus of all of my education work, not at necessarily the college that I'm at now, but before that, I had a podcast for several years called All Keyed Up. It was mostly during the pandemic. Once the lockdowns were done, then I got a little too busy to keep it going. But I did it a lot. It was about 60 interviews. It was an interview podcast all about piano teaching, but it was very broadly focused. So although some of the interviews were really the nuts and bolts of piano pedagogy, like I had one with, if any of your listeners know, Marvin Blickenstaff, he's a very well-respected piano teacher. So I had some interviews like that really got into piano pedagogy, but then I also had some very broad interviews. I had one about Alexander technique, one was about the history of improvisation. And so I was very interested in approaching the topic of piano teaching as broadly as I possibly could. But with all of it, the idea was always, as your question indicated, branching out from the type of piano instruction that I had before Chris, the types of teachers I had in elementary school, which are not bad, but are, I would say, a little old-fashioned and very traditional. You go to the lesson, you do your scales, you do your sight reading, you go through your repertoire pieces, you go home, they assign more scales, more repertoire pieces. And again, nothing is wrong with that. And I do all of those things in my lesson, but I'm very excited about other types of things you can do in piano lessons to encourage creativity on top of these more traditional musical skills. So there's a lot of categories in which this can go, and my podcast explores all of them. Again, it was about 60 episodes when all was said and done, and I also sometimes do talks at conferences about this topic too. Not to do a little plug, but if there's one in Chicago, Music Teachers National Association Conference, that's next spring, so I'm going to talk there. Okay, so one category is apps and technology. So there's a lot of creative apps there. One really good one is Piano Maestro. I have one episode on All Keyed Up about that, which is great for sight reading because it's on the iPad. It has a backing track and the notes go across the screen and you play along with the track and it corrects you as you play. So that's a really fun one, and it's sort of game structured. So it's a much more fun alternative to sight reading. I really like GarageBand as a way to work on composition with students. I have a few episodes of the podcast that are all about teaching composition. There are lots of great apps for improvisation. Two good ones that come to mind are iReal Pro and MusicLock. It gives a background track that the student can improvise over. I feel very strongly about the pedagogical importance of improvisation. I have a few episodes about that on the podcast. The one that comes to mind is Brenda Earl Stokes. We have a whole episode all about improvisation and offering different resources on how to teach improvisation in lessons, because a lot of piano teachers are very weary of teaching improvisation because they don't feel like improvisers themselves. So those are some good apps. I mean, there are many others. Another option of something to do that goes beyond cookie cutter piano lessons is to teach, like I studied in college, composition and songwriting, and that can come from improvisation. There's a whole teaching sequence, which I can get into if that interests you, about how to have students write their own songs. If they are the type who like to sing, then it can be songs with lyrics, which is another great way to incorporate creativity because it's multidisciplinary when you work with them on lyric writing. And a few of the talks I've given at conferences are about how to teach songwriting within the context of a piano lesson. So everything you do is still tied to the ultimate goal of teaching piano. Then there's also, if they don't like to sing, you could teach composition, whether it's at the piano or if you use an app like GarageBand, you can use multiple instruments and have them create drum beats and such on top of the piano. So even if the music itself is pretty basic, it will still sound like a real piece. So I'm very passionate about incorporating composition and songwriting into lessons. There's a lot of organizations that have resources for piano teachers that share the same big picture goal that I do about trying to broaden piano lessons to be more creative. So two that come to mind are Nicola Canton has Colorful Keys. She appeared on the podcast, and she has an organization called Vibrant Music Teaching, which is great for piano teachers who want to go outside the box. Another one is Tim Topham, has topmusic.co. He has both a podcast and the organization, which you can get a membership for. And Nicola Canton has the same thing. I think it's called Vibrant Music Teaching Podcast. So those are two organizations that are really good. Another category, I mean, not to get too long-winded with this, but another element of piano teaching that I'm very passionate about is teaching by rote. This is something that got a bad rep a few decades ago because sometimes learning by rote, before I go on, I should define that term. By rote, I mean learning a piece through imitating a visual model as opposed to reading sheet music. So the teacher will model how a few seconds of a piece goes there on the piano with no sheet music, and then the student will imitate what they just saw. So it's more based on memory and ear training, and we remove the element of notation. That's a big passion of mine. Is I do think that a lot of piano teachers focus very heavily on note reading and notation, which is very important, but can be limiting because often our students are capable of playing much fancier pieces on the piano than what they can read. And so I'm very passionate about rote teaching. There's an episode of my podcast with Samantha Coates, who has a lot of resources by that. Another good resource for that is Little Gems for Piano by Paula Dreyer. So there's rote pieces, improvisation, composition, apps, teaching organizations like Nicola Canton and Tim Topham. And then I would say those are some of the big things. We could get into any of
Yeah.
those more, but the basic big picture for getting into the weeds is trying to see piano teaching as more open-ended and creative than some of the traditional approaches. One other one I forgot to say, and then I promise I'm done, is using method books that incorporate pieces from a wide variety of styles and not just classical pieces. So there's many out there. Gerald Simon has some good ones. The Piano Adventures has a lot of supplemental books that are really good for this, but I'm very passionate about having students play in all types of styles and not just classical as well.
That's a lot of great stuff. I appreciate that. And we might come back and visit some of those
Mhm.
topics. But one of the things that I'm curious about is as you did the podcast, what was your
Mhm.
approach? I'm a podcaster myself, several
Yeah.
domains, not just this one.
Hmm.
What's your approach to deciding what to talk about? Of
Mm.
course, if you have a guest, I suppose that's maybe obvious, but maybe even which guests you reach out to. Did you have any sort of method to the madness when it came to kind of planning the episodes, the topics out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there are two components to that question. The first component is about who I spoke to on the podcast, and then the second part of the question is once a guest was selected, how to figure out what to talk about. The second one is a little more complicated than the first one. As far as who I spoke to, truly, I tried to just speak to, I guess, similar to what you're trying to do here is the biggest people in the industry and people who I felt like had something interesting to say. I mean, when I first started doing the podcast, I was truly just a very run-of-the-mill piano teacher. I had never spoken at a conference. I had never paid for a membership to any kind of teaching organization. I mean, my focus was music directing. It really was inspired by the fact that COVID came and we were locked down, and so my theater was not producing, and so my career switched to full-time piano teaching, and I wanted to get better. So I wanted to interview the best people that I could. So it was mostly based on reputation, but then there were a few cases where it was someone who they themselves might not necessarily have been well known, but they focused in their career on something that I thought was really interesting. Like one person whose focus, as I mentioned before, was the history of improvisation. And so I thought that was really interesting. So that would be how I picked guests. As far as how to plan the interview, this changed over the course of my career. And it's a similar change that happened to music directing. What I, both with music directing and with podcast interviewing, and to an extent with teaching as well. I think earlier in my career, I over planned. And so at the beginning of the podcast journey, I would write a really long winded list of interview questions and I would go through them basically like a script. I was very paranoid about running out of things to talk about. So I had a long list of questions and I would send the interviewer the questions in advance. And what I found doing that is it felt number one, scripted, but also it didn't feel like I was really engaging with them because I would ask a question and they would give a response and they would say all sorts of interesting things in the response. But instead of latching on to that and using what they said as an opportunity to keep the conversation going, I would just move on to the next question. And even as they were giving their answer, I was thinking in my head about, okay, what am I going to say when they're done? And so after doing a few episodes, I tried to be a lot more spontaneous and go where the conversation went. And so, yes, I would come in with a few topics that I wanted to discuss, but I wouldn't write out a list of interview questions. And it was the same thing with music directing. I would, in the earlier stages of my career, come with copious notes of how I wanted every measure to sound. And it was basically just execute when I was in the room with the singer. They were basically just a vessel to do what I wanted. And it was not collaborative in the way that I think it should have been. And so now I come not less prepared, but I come much more open to seeing how the singer sounds and taking it from there, and a lot more like, oh, I liked that thing you did there. Maybe we could try that here. That type of thing, as opposed to measure one, I want this. Beat two, you're going to put the T here, the chest voice here. It's a lot less pre-packaged. And same thing with teaching. I used to write much more detailed lesson plans earlier in my career where every minute was planned. And this activity is going to take 3 minutes and this activity is 5 minutes. And so it would be very boxed in. And now I've become much more flexible with it. So that's been my sort of journey through figuring out podcast interviews. Just out of curiosity, would you say anything similar happened with you over the course of your interview experience?
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Well, my personality is very improvisational. Talking about
Yeah.
improvisation, so I almost
Hmm.
feel this may not be 100% correct, but I feel like I do better if I'm improvising than if
Yeah.
it's planned.
Yeah.
Now
I
it
think
doesn't,
most people are like that. Yeah.
yeah. But that said, in some ways, I'm trying to think, there was a little bit of a reversal of the process where in the beginning I might have not planned as much, maybe with that impetus of let's have an engaging interactive conversation, not one
Hmm.
that is planned out too much.
Hmm.
And but then as I started to engage with other podcasters that, had great content, it is actually intriguing how much can is planned and controlled in
Hmm.
some of the environments where it feels most uh, unscripted,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's a delicate balance, and I think
Yeah.
the and I've been on podcast interviews, not terribly many because I wanted to avoid it, but I've definitely been on podcast interviews where, you know, the both terrible ends of the spectrum. One where it's just they have a list of questions
Yeah.
and then they just read them and then you answer and it doesn't sound like they're listening. And then other ones where they just kind of show up and you have no idea what they're doing. Like,
Yes, I will
and you
say
want to like
that.
plan it
Yes.
out for them or something.
Yes, there are
Yeah.
times, and I've certainly heard podcast interviews, and not just podcast, even news interviews or all sorts of interviews where it is the opposite problem, where the interviewer clearly has not knows nothing about the person and is
Mhm.
it just feels like it's a way like that's what you're talking with them about. Like you have this person who's an expert on so and you're just talking about this random topic. And it's so yes, as you said, it's a delicate balance. What I try to do at the end of the podcast is still research the person I was talking to a good bit so I came knowledgeable about them, but not overdo it in terms of writing interview questions.
Mhm.
But it's a
Yeah.
tough balance, and also different things work for different people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and actually the research part of it is kind of a fun part that means you
oh
don't
yeah.
necessarily have to,
Hmm.
script out as many questions because
Yeah.
you now, it's just like you have this domain now that you just know about. You know about them, you know about the things they do,
Yeah.
and you can just kind of
Yeah.
touch upon
Another
areas
change
that
I
way.
would say I also made over the course of podcasting related to this is when I first started, I think I felt a need to show off the research. I did a lot. Like if you listen to any of these early episodes of All Keyed Up, anytime a guest said something that I had read about, I would interject, that's what you said, and but this is the article, very show offy. And I think over the course of time, I stopped doing that. So that's another good
Yes.
change I think that was made. But
Yes.
I'm always
On
very impressed when I
page
watch.
22.
Yes, exactly. That was me. But I'm always very impressed when I see great interviewers, again, whether it's podcasting or whether it's a news interviewer or even people who interview celebrities, and they can come up with these great follow-up questions right off the top of their head based on what the interviewee said. I have tremendous admiration for people who can do that.
Yeah, it is great, and a lot of it just comes down to listening, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. And I would say
paying
the same
attention
thing
when somebody's
about
talking.
great teaching. I'm always very impressed when I watch master classes and the person running the master class off the top of their head is able to give really precise, specific feedback that clearly they didn't come in already planned. I'm always very impressed by that. And then unfortunately, there's been some master classes I've seen that I think are kind of like what I used to be with podcasting, where they have their idea of what they think good piano playing is, and they are just saying it to the student. They're not reacting to really what it is that was unique or interesting about the person who just played. They're just saying the same thing they always do. So I think it's similar across all fields, is there needs to be an ability to be spontaneous and to really actively listen and react in real time.
So that's a great segue to go back to something that you touched
Mhm,
upon, and that's improvisation.
mhm,
So I'm curious what your own history
mhm,
of experience with improvisation is,
mhm,
kind of when you first started getting into it, how you expanded your own skills,
mhm.
and then, yeah, what are some of the ways that you tend to introduce it to students?
Great. Love that question. So, as far as me, uh, it was again that Chris Davis was the one who really got me into that. All my teachers before her never said the word improvisation at any point, whereas she was so obsessed with it. I mean, basically, anytime a new concept was introduced, the knee-jerk reaction was improvise with it. So we learn about what compound time is, improvise in compound time. We learn about what the blues scale is, improvise with the blues scale. We learn a new scale. We learn E major, improvise in it. And that was just always the knee-jerk way to teach a new concept. And that is a huge part of my teaching nowadays is everything should go back to improvisation. I often compare it to if we learn a language. Like, let's say I was trying to learn French. It would not be a very positive experience if the only way I learned French was reading French out loud or repeating things back to me that other people said in French. At some point, you have to make up your own sentences in French. That should be the bulk of it. And I do feel music, which in some ways or many ways is a language, should be structured similarly. And so as far as part of your question was how I introduce improvisation with students, it's the same way Chris did. Whenever a new concept is introduced, make them improvise with it. And that's true whether it's a scale, whether it's a music theory concept, also whether it's something in a piece that's tripping them up. So if they have a piece with Alberti bass, I don't know if your listeners will know what that is, but basically, in case they don't, I'll turn on original sound so I can play and give a model. It's just when the left hand goes 1, 5, 3, 5, like that sort of
Hmm.
pattern. Like I'm in the wrong octave, but we get the idea. So if a
Yeah.
student is having trouble keeping up that left hand Alberti bass, instead of just drilling it, have them improvise with it. Have them move the sheet music away, stop reading, and just play that pattern in your left hand while the right hand improvises over it. So really, the way that I encourage teaching improvisation is to subsume it into everything else. I think a lot of times when teachers first start teaching improvisation, it's walled off into its own category that's distinct from the rest of the lesson. So you'll have your 5 minutes of sight reading, your 5 minutes of theory, your 20 minutes of working on the repertoire pieces. And then at the end, for fun, for 2 minutes, sort of like a game, you do improvisation. And for me, I think it should be spread throughout and integrated into everything else. So that's how I try to encourage improvisation. Another thing that I often do in pieces is have students rewrite the endings. So if there's a phrase that goes a certain way in a repertoire piece that they're playing, take away the final measure of the phrase and have the students improvise something else. I mean, that's another thing you can do. So improvising with their pieces, I feel like is a great way for students to experience the piece in an inside and out way, and at I would argue a deeper level than if they just play it. So that would be some of the ways that I encourage teaching improvisation. But for more of a deep dive, not to do a shameless plug, but there's the so the very first episode of All Keyed Up is with Brenda Earl Stokes, and it's all about teaching improvisation.
Great. Um, Going back to that once more, I'm curious how the students respond. So I can imagine a couple of different pathways,
Mhm,
and I'm sure any of these is going to manifest, but there may be nuances. So one, I'm sure there's some students that just they just don't like improvising as
mhm.
much as playing with something that's provided. And
Yep,
maybe, even though you make them and they do it, it just may not be something they pick up.
yep.
But also I can imagine that some of the obstacles to improvising. A lot of times when you run into these classical players that have played for years and they say, "Well, I don't improvise," right? A lot of it is just kind of getting them over the initial resistance and mindset, and then,
Mhm.
they can get into it and they can start doing it. So how much do you see that the fact that you're making them, right, is kind of getting them into a place where they, oh, okay, I guess I kind of enjoy improvising, like it's turning them on to something. And also maybe it sounds like, what I find when it comes to improvisation, even in any domain,
Mhm.
something in life, hey,
Yeah.
just go start a conversation with a stranger or whatever.
Yes.
Most people are just like, no thanks. But what they want, if anything, is like, hey, let me hold your hand and like,
Mm.
let's go, do a little bit, and just kind of like test the waters and take it step by step by step. So, yeah, tell me about the varied responses you get to this idea of
Yeah.
improv and how you introduce it gently or not to
Mhm.
people who are resistant.
Sure. I'd actually like to start the answer to that with the analogy you brought up of people who feel like start a conversation with anyone and they get scared. I
Hmm.
I think that overlaps a lot with music, and I think the solution to both is actually the same. I think partly why people sometimes get nervous about like if they're at the bus stop trying to start a conversation with a stranger or something is that there's too many options of what you could talk about and people get very overwhelmed very quickly. There's actually an interesting book by Barry Schwartz, psychologist, called The Paradox of Choice about how when we have too many choices, it stresses us out. And that's why some people get, he talks in the book about grocery stores and how Trader Joe's, if your listeners know where that is a genius approach to a grocery store because for each category of food, there's really only a few options. And so you can feel confident in what you chose when you had just a few options, as opposed to a gigantic grocery store where you always are, do I pick this? Do I pick that? And I would say the same thing with music and with a conversation. So I'm going to stay on the conversation analogy before I bring it to music. If we think of talking, if you I assume most people who feel anxious about starting up a conversation with someone, if they had those conversation cards, I remember I was at a cafe once and there was this game or something where it was like cards that give you things to talk about, but it
Right.
was like fun little questions. I think most people would feel nervous in a cafe talking to someone new and just
Hmm.
making the conversation happen would feel a little less nervous if they had these cards that were like, what's your opinion of, do you prefer football or baseball? Why? Like once some of the decisions are made for them, it becomes less nerve-wracking. I would say the same thing for music. So oftentimes when teachers are teaching improvisation and the student is at the piano, they'll say, make something up. Go free time. And that is, I think, when we get some of the panicking responses that you were alluding to.
Right.
Sometimes not with younger children, they enjoy doing that, but especially with older students, they can be very self-conscious. And so I think the solution to that is adding constraints and limiting
Mm.
choices the same way that Trader Joe's does, the same way that having a conversation card to use, like that game I saw at the cafe,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot less nerve-wracking. So at the most extreme, I mean, it could be truly as extreme as you're only allowed to play in the D major five finger position in the right hand, and you're only allowed to do one, two, and three, four. That's it. I mean, once you do something like that, there are so many of the initial decisions made that students are a lot less likely to feel self-conscious and nerve-wracked. I think I just made up a word there, but I'm a lot less nervous than if you just give them complete freedom. And so when I'm working with students, if they express nervousness over improvising, I just keep adding constraints until they feel more confident. And I don't think I've had too many experiences where if I keep adding constraints, I mean, eventually they are more open-minded about it. Another thing I would say is I think like a lot of things in life, just because they might be skeptical at first, doesn't mean we have to give up. And I think it's interesting to me that there's a lot of categories in music, like sight reading or theory, where if a student is initially resistant, it's sort of accepted in the teaching world of, okay, I mean, that doesn't mean you stop doing it. But for some
Hmm.
reason, with improvisation, teachers are much more sympathetic if the student is initially
Hmm.
fearful of it. I think it's okay if they're fearful of it, give it a shot and see what
Hmm.
happens. But again, without reiterating this too much, I think the solution to how to teach improvisation at the beginning levels is to place as many constraints as you can. So it could be rhythmic constraints, it could be scale constraints, it could be dynamic constraints, articulation constraints, it could be chord constraints, but make a lot of the initial decisions for them so they're improvising within a much narrower fine. And then later, as they get more advanced, then you can open it up and become more and more free. It reminds me of my composition teacher in college, where for all of his beginner students who are coming to composition for the first time, the assignment is write a whole piece based on a 3-note motive. And he worked with the students on all the things you can do with a 3-note motive. And that's how they do it. That's their first exposure, is they can't write anything that doesn't have to do with these 3 notes. And I think that that is a lot less nerve-wracking than if you just say, compose a piece. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that would be my approach.
appreciate that. Yeah, Stravinsky quote, the more constraints one imposes,
Yes.
the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit.
I have talked about that quote many, many times. I think I even brought up that quote on the podcast once. If not, I bring that up to my students all the time. Love that quote.
That's a good one. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the practicing. So
Mm.
sometimes you talk about students who struggle with consistent
hmm
practice. Any ideas to share there?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a sneak preview of what I'm going to be talking about in Chicago at the Music Teachers National Association conference in the spring. If anyone listening is interested in that, love to see you in Chicago. Come say hi. It's a multi-layered question. There's a lot of things that could be determining that. You have to sort of diagnose it first to figure out what's really at the heart of why the practicing is limited. But I'll just flash a few basic ideas, and there's much more to say about all of this, but a few things. First, it's very valuable to turn a lesson into guided practice and then make the lesson be about how to effectively practice. So if I have a student who came and they have a repertoire piece that they didn't practice it, then my first step is I'll say, let's practice it together. What should we do first? What should we do next? Because I find almost all students need really constant reminders about how to practice. I think a lot of teachers forget to talked with their students about that. And the student plays a piece and then they work on it. It gets better and better and better. But then over the next week, it sort of stagnates, and it's because the student isn't practicing well. So I think it's a really good learning opportunity to work with students on how to practice if they show up having not practiced. That's one way of doing it. In some cases, you could have a 15-minute lesson in the middle of the week that is just a devoted guided practice lesson on top of your regular practice. That's something I've done with a few students, and that's a way to generate some extra income. So those are some of the more basic options. Then there are a few other options that are a little more out of the box. A more out of the box option would be changing the nature of the practicing and make it not the standard type of practicing. So you could make assignments in GarageBand. You can make assignments in the app Piano Maestro. You could make composition assignments. You could have them like Chris did for me, if they're the right age, do an essay. You could do listening assignments is a really big one. The advantage of listening assignments is the parent can enforce it. You can just have the parent play the piece in the car. Suzuki, I know, has a lot of listening assignments. So you could do listening assignments. So changing the nature of an assignment is an example. Communication with parents is really important, and trying to get the student on a schedule as opposed to practicing whenever they get around to it, which is very dicey unless the student is very disciplined. So what I try to tell parents is the earlier the better, because if you schedule the practicing for late, like after dinner, inevitably something will come up that'll create a domino effect. So if it could be right after school, they do it. That's another way to encourage practicing. Then there's also rewards and also practice tracking. These are related but are different. Practice tracking would be marking down every week, like a journal of some sort where they mark down how much they practice, or there's some kind of visual marker to show them the progress they're making, because sometimes students feel like they're practicing into an empty abyss and they don't really get what it's all for. But if they can see some visual marker that shows how much practicing they've done, shows what they've practiced, it becomes a lot more salient to the students what the advantage is of the practicing than if it's, again, out into an empty space. Then related to that, but not entirely the same, is to do rewards. This is a dicey and contentious area in the piano teaching community about if you do a reward of, if you do 10 good weeks of practicing in a row and your parent signs off on it, you get so-and-so prize. The debate in the piano teaching world is whether that reduces intrinsic motivation and it becomes extrinsic motivation. And so then they practice just for the reward as opposed to for the joy of learning. I mean, that's a long conversation. In my opinion, the two are not at odds in the way that some people think. And so I am fond for certain students of using some kind of extrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
Another thing to look at as a teacher is sometimes it's an issue with the pieces themselves and it's a difficulty challenge. And so the reason students aren't practicing is if it's too hard, then they feel like it doesn't matter how much they're practicing, they feel helpless. And so they give up and they dread practicing because it's so hard. But then on the flip side, if the piece is too easy, sometimes the students feel like I don't need to practice, it'll be fine at the lesson. Sometimes it's a matter of the quality of the pieces. If it's a piece that the student is not enthusiastic about, they're less likely to want to practice than if it's a fun piece, which is why I encourage teaching in multiple styles and taking student requests if possible, if you can find an arrangement that's doable. So those are some of the ways I would encourage working with students who show up with practicing challenges, but there's much more to say about each of those. And come to my talk in Chicago next spring.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you've got a wealth of information, and I love the kind of hunger you have to do a great job and sort of bring new things in all the time. It's wonderful, and I'm sure, you know, you're sort of on your tenure track. You're
Mm-hmm.
continuing to teach, and I'm excited to see, where you're going to be in 5 or 10
Oh,
years. You're
thank
going
you.
to
I
have so many
appreciate that.
more tools and ideas in
Sa-
the arsenal.
Same thing with you and Piano Tech Masterclass. Excited to see this growing as well. I've watched a few of your episodes before coming here. It seems like you're growing a lot as well. And so excited to see what happens with you also.
Thank you. Um, Before we cut out, is there any final things you want to share with the audience, words of wisdom, the upcoming things? I know you mentioned the conference in Chicago. Any place else you want to send them or
I would say if
anything?
anyone has a question about anything I said today, or if they want to try to expand the focus of their private teaching, perhaps in a more open-ended creative direction, on my website, benkapilow.com, BENKAPILOW.com, there's a contact page where they can feel free to reach out to me. And then on that website is also all the episodes of my podcast, and it's all free. So you can listen to that if you want to learn any more about anything else I said today. So that's my
Okay.
website.
Okay, great. All right, I'll sign us out and we'll let you go. Um, by chance, do you have a minute to jump back on after we're done? I know you might have a tight
Yeah.
schedule today.
No, it's
Yeah,
fine.
okay.
Sure.
I'll end the Zoom meeting
Hmm.
after I sign us out and then just jump back on the Zoom link and we'll have a quick chat to wrap up. But other than that, I will say we have reached the end of another musical journey here at Piano Tech Radio Hour. Thanks again to Ben Kapilow for joining us today, as well
Hmm.
as our live studio audience. As well, we're brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses. That's cutting edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. For those of you that joined us today by signing up for the session independently, hey, you can make your life more convenient. Subscribe to Piano Tech Radio Hour. It's just 16 bucks a month. You get the recording of today's session and video in our member area, as well as automatic registration for each week's new session. And you can sign up at bit.ly/join PTRH. That's bit.ly/join PTRH. We've got the audio only podcast you can check out. We've got the Substat. We've got the socials, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, email list you can find on the website at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. You'll get updates about these little previews and recaps of all of these sessions. And yeah, check out the new sister project, the Future Education podcast. That's leading in some very interesting directions, and love to have your support and feedback on that one. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you again next week. Bye bye.